Around 18 months ago, I made a video about what, in my opinion, were some good choices of fountain pens for urban sketching. Since then, I've bought quite a few new pens, so I thought perhaps it was a good time to revisit that video and see what new pens have impressed me, which ones have stood the test of time, and perhaps which ones have disappeared from my pencil case. So let's start with the pen that's probably stood the test of time better than any of the others. This is a Sailor Fude de Mannen. It's got a bent nib, and this one's bent at 40 degrees. I've got a pink one and a blue one, but apart from the colour, they're exactly the same. The reason I love Fude nibs for sketching is that you can get lots of variation in your line thickness just by changing the angle at which you hold the pen. So I can get very fine lines for little details by holding the pen more upright, then lower the angle and get much broader marks. You can even turn the pen upside down to get even finer lines. I do also have a green one. This one's slightly different because its nib is bent at 55 degrees, so you can get even thicker lines when you hold the pen flatter. I do have a dedicated video about using Fude nibs, and I actually compare the 40 and the 55 degree versions, which you might be interested in watching if you're not familiar with them. They do get through quite a lot of ink though, particularly when you're making the broader marks obviously, which is actually one of the reasons that I like having two with me, because if I'm going out sketching all day I can take both and I've got a backup if one runs out rather than having to carry a bottle of ink around. My main irritation with Sailor is that you have to buy the converter separately. It's not included with the pen and it's proprietary. I've been through all my boxes of other converters that I've accumulated probably since my school days, and I've never found another one that fits a Sailor pen. And actually, while we're talking about converters, this is probably quite a good time to explain something quickly that applies to quite a few of the pens that I'm going to show. Because I use fountain pens for pen and watercolour sketching, I use waterproof or water-resistant ink. My usual choice is platinum carbon ink because once it's dry I can paint over my line work without it bleeding into the watercolour. Most fountain pens come with 1 or 2 ink cartridges free in the box, but unless I know they contain waterproof ink, which they pretty much never do, I don't use them. I don't even put one in just to try the pen out, because even a tiny amount of non-waterproof ink left behind can mix with the waterproof ink that I put in afterwards, and then when I add watercolour, the lines can bleed. A converter basically allows you to fill a cartridge pen from a bottle of ink. You can empty and refill one of the free cartridges using a blunt syringe, which I sometimes do. This is the way that I do it. I take one of the free cartridges that came with the pen and put it in the pen as if I'm going to use it to pierce the cartridge. Remove the cartridge from the pen, then use the blunt syringe to empty as much ink as you can out of the cartridge. You'll probably need to do this quite a few times to get as much out of it as you can. Once it's nearly empty, you'll probably find that you've got to rinse it a few times with water and keep extracting the water until it runs clear. Try not to skimp on this step because any water-soluble ink that touches your watercolour will bleed. Once the cartridge is completely empty and the water is running clear, let it dry thoroughly before you use a blunt syringe to refill it with water-resistant ink. And some pens can also be filled directly into the barrel using silicone to seal them. This isn't something I've tried, so I can't show you a video of that. So if you hear me say that you need to buy a converter, what I really mean is if you don't want to use either of those methods. Personally, if a converter comes with a pen, I see that as a definite bonus. If it doesn't and you want to go down the converter route, you'll need to factor that extra cost into the price of the pen. And converters aren't necessarily universal, whatever the Amazon description might tell you. Sailor, as I mentioned earlier, are an example of this and use proprietary fitting. Anyway, going back to the pens, another Sailor is one of my most recent purchases. This is the Sailor Prophet with a 55 degree Fude nib. The nib itself is the same as the one on the long-bodied 55 degree Fude de Mannen. The main difference, or only difference that I found, is the shape and style of the body. Personally, I prefer this more conventional pen shape to the very long body of the 55 degree Sailor, but that's really just personal preference. If you already have the 55 degree Sailor de Mannen, you don't need to buy this one instead. But really, when do you ever need to buy another pen? But it's also more compact, which makes it easier to fit into some of my smaller sketching kits. Unfortunately, once again, being Sailor, you need the proprietary Sailor converter, and it doesn't come with it. but you definitely don't need to spend a lot of money to get a really good fountain pen for sketching. In fact, one of my biggest surprises since my last video has been one of the cheapest pens here. This is the Platinum Preppy. I originally bought this for travelling because I wanted to use platinum carbon ink, but without packing a potentially breakable bottle in my suitcase that would get thrown onto a plane. And this is actually the exception to what I said earlier about cartridges, because you can buy platinum carbon ink cartridges specifically for it. So I know I'm putting waterproof ink straight into the pen. I bought this mainly as a cheap, practical travel pen and honestly wasn't expecting very much from it, but it drew beautifully. The ink flowed really nicely, it was lovely to sketch with, and considering how inexpensive these are, I was really impressed. So if you want a very inexpensive fountain pen for sketching, particularly if you're travelling and like the convenience of waterproof cartridges, this is very easy to recommend. My other new budget discovery actually came about because of something that's always slightly irritated me about another pen that I already owned. These are my Kaweco Sports. I have two, a plastic one and a metal one, and I really like them. They're small, compact, come in some lovely colours, and they're very convenient for carrying around. But the converter is priced on top of the price of the pen, and it's very fiddly. In fact, I haven't even bothered buying a second converter for my other Kaweco because a cartridge holds considerably more ink. But then I discovered this. This is the Hongdian M2. It's not dissimilar in overall size and shape to the Kaweco Sport. It's made of metal. It has a lovely weight in the hand, and it comes with a converter, a normal screw type one, rather than that fiddly little plunger. I originally bought this blue one with a medium nib, and I liked it so much that I went and bought another one with a fine nib. For the price, I think these are really impressive little pens, and that doesn't mean I suddenly dislike my Kawecos. I still think they're lovely pens. The metal Kaweco in particular feels beautifully made, although it is considerably more expensive. Another pen from my original video that you probably haven't seen me using very much lately is my TWSBI Eco, but that's definitely not because I've fallen out of love with it. This is still an excellent fountain pen. It writes beautifully smoothly. Mine has always been very reliable. I don't have problems with hard starts, and it holds loads of ink. It doesn't need a cartridge or a converter because it has a built-in piston filling system, so the ink goes directly into the pen itself. And another thing I really like is that you can actually see how much ink you have left. So if you're heading out for a day's sketching, you can immediately see whether you need to top it up. In fact, if you ask me which of all of these is probably the best all-rounder, I'd still find it very difficult to beat the TWSBI Eco. The only reason you don't see me using it very much at the moment is that I simply have too many pens. Just because I don't use a pen very often doesn't automatically mean I don't like it or wouldn't recommend it. I realise I don't own a fraction of the number of pens that some people do, but I still have more than I probably need. And inevitably, some of them just don't get used for a while. A good example of this is this Jinhao Fude nib pen, which I featured in a whole video of its own. It cost me about £10, I think, including a converter, and it has a much chunkier body than the Sailor, which I know won't be to everyone's taste, but personally I find it very comfortable to hold, and for the price I was very impressed with it. I don't use it very much now, but I can't actually give you a particularly good reason why. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. I've simply found myself gravitating towards my Sailors instead. So I certainly wouldn't take this one off my recommendation list, particularly if you'd like to try a Fude nib without spending very much money. And then there's this rather unusual submarine pen which I was sent to try. It feels beautifully made and very premium, and it has this clever filling mechanism that means you can refill it without even taking the end off. It's a clever idea, although I do think it's perhaps slightly gimmicky because the downside is you can't actually see how much ink you've put in. But it's a lovely pen to use. And then at the considerably more expensive end of my collection, I now have these. This is my Esterbrook Estie Charlie Brown edition, which I've got for Christmas. It's a beautiful pen, and one of the things that particularly appealed to me about this is its connection with Charles Schulz, who used Esterbrook pens in his work creating the Peanuts cartoons, hence it being the Charlie Brown edition. I won't go into loads of detail about this one because I've already made an entire video about it, which I'll link below. But I liked my first Esterbrook so much that after admiring their resin pens for quite some time, I eventually treated myself to this honeycomb one as well. They're beautiful pens that feel lovely to use, and I really enjoy owning them. So far, most of the pens I've talked about that I don't use very often are still pens I like and would happily recommend. But there are a few where my experience hasn't been quite so positive. This is the Hongdian Black Forest with a Fude nib, and much as I love my new M2s, I never really got on with this one. There are two reasons, one of which is entirely personal preference. I like a pen with a slightly fatter body, and this one is quite slim, so I didn't find it particularly comfortable. And yes, I realise that the Sailor Fude de Mannens also have a slim body, but somehow they just feel different in my hand. But the bigger problem was that mine kept hard starting. The ink never seemed to flow particularly reliably, even after I cleaned it out, and eventually I just stopped using it. Obviously, that's just my experience with this particular pen. I know lots of people love them. And while we're talking about ink not flowing and hard starts, that brings me to my Lamy Safaris and this Lamy All-Star. The Lamy Safari is almost an iconic fountain pen amongst urban sketchers, and lots of people absolutely love them. And clearly I wanted to love them too, because I somehow ended up buying several of them. I can't actually find my red one. But unfortunately mine have repeatedly clogged or hard started after they've been left unused. Now, I will freely admit that I'm not the world's best at cleaning my fountain pens. I'm also not particularly good at remembering to empty them if I'm not going to use them for a while. But most of my other pens seem remarkably tolerant of my neglect. My Sailors, for example, have sometimes sat in drawers for months and then worked perfectly well and I've brought them out again. But my Lamys haven't been nearly as forgiving. There's one other thing worth mentioning about the Safari, and that's the grip. It has these flattened areas where you hold the pen, which effectively guide your fingers into a particular position. Personally, that's never really bothered me, but I know some people find it uncomfortable because if that isn't naturally where you want to put your fingers, the pen is effectively trying to tell you how to hold it. So if you're thinking of buying one, it might be worth actually holding one first if you get the opportunity. I know plenty of people who absolutely love their Lamys, so I'm certainly not saying they're bad pens. They're just not pens I personally find myself reaching for anymore. There's one pen from my original video that I do particularly want to update you on because I know some of you bought one after seeing me recommend it, and that's the Jinhao X750. I really liked this pen when I first got it, and everything I said about it in that original video was based on my experience with it at that time. But mine subsequently went on a flight with me, and at some point after that it started leaking. That doesn't necessarily mean that the flight caused it, and it certainly doesn't mean that every Jinhao X750 is going to start leaking. But mine did, and because of that I stopped using it, so I definitely wanted to mention that in this update. And finally there's my Pilot Parallel. They come in a variety of nib widths, but you do have to buy the converter separately as well with this one. I bought this because it looked interesting and it produces some really unusual broad and varied marks, and I used it once. I don't think I've used it since. There's nothing particularly wrong with it, nothing particularly right with it though. For me it was just a bit of a novelty, and it never became part of the way I naturally sketch. If I lost it tomorrow I probably wouldn't replace it or even notice. And actually all these pens sitting around unused led me to one very simple tip. If you have several fountain pens, then just use them for ordinary writing as well as sketching. Write your shopping lists with them, make notes with them, leave one on your desk and actually use it. It keeps the ink flowing and gives all those neglected pens a chance to come out of the drawer occasionally. So after another 18 months of using fountain pens for urban sketching, where does that leave me? If I had to pick the pen I use most, it would still be my Sailor Fude de Mannen, probably the 40 degree. I love the variation of line I can get from it. It's reliable, and despite owning much more expensive pens, it's still the one that most often ends up in my sketch bag. For the best all-rounder, I think I'd still choose the TWSBI Eco. It's smooth, reliable, holds loads of ink. You can see exactly how much ink you have left, and there's no converter to buy. For a really inexpensive option, I've been hugely impressed by the Platinum Preppy, particularly for travelling because I can use water-resistant ink cartridges. And probably my biggest new budget discovery is the Hongdian M2. I like the first one enough to immediately buy another, which I think speaks for itself. If you want to experiment with a Fude nib without spending very much, I still think that chunky Jinhao is well worth considering too. And at the other end of the price range, I absolutely love my Esterbrook's, but I think all this proves that you really don't need to spend a lot of money to get a great fountain pen for sketching. So I'd love to know what your favourite fountain pen is for sketching, particularly if there's one you keep coming back to no matter how many others you buy. Let me know in the comments because clearly I need absolutely no encouragement whatsoever to discover another fountain pen. I hope you found this update useful. Thank you very much for watching and happy sketching.